Welcome, dear listeners, to a tale of haunting melodies and shadowed whispers. A story where the boundary between life and death is blurred by the power of music. Tonight, we follow Colin, a struggling musician whose search for inspiration leads him to a forgotten corner of the world. Oakview Cemetery. It is a place steeped in legend, where sorrowful voices are said to rise on moonlit nights, weaving songs so beautiful they could capture your very soul. But beware, for these harmonies are not meant for the living. The cemetery choir sings not just to be heard, but to be answered. As Colin steps into the cold embrace of the graveyard, armed with his guitar and recorder, he cannot know the price he'll pay to uncover the truth. What begins as a quest for creativity soon becomes a chilling descent into obsession, as the ghostly song pulls him ever deeper. So sit back, turn the lights low, and let the music guide you into the shadows. But be warned, once you hear the choir's call, you may never escape its grip. This is the Cemetery Choir. The winter wind whispered through the leafless trees as Colin trudged along the gravel path leading to Oakview Cemetery. His breath formed frosty clouds in the air, dissipating as quickly as they appeared. The worn leather strap of his guitar case dug into his shoulder, but he clung to it like a talisman, unwilling to let it go. The cemetery, sprawling across the edge of town, was a place he usually avoided, at least until he'd overheard a strange story that wouldn't leave him alone. It started at the cafe, where musicians gathered to vent their frustrations over dwindling gigs and missed opportunities. Old Mr. Beckett, the self-proclaimed town historian, had been sharing one of his many local legends. This one, he said, was about a cemetery choir, a group of ghostly voices said to sing in haunting harmony on moonlit nights. Beckett had even mentioned something chilling, how the voices might sometimes call a listener's name, as though inviting them to join the song. Colin had dismissed the tale at first, thinking it was just another one of Beckett's dramatic ramblings. But the idea had lodged itself in his mind. He was desperate for inspiration after months of creative stagnation. And the thought of capturing something so unique, a supernatural choir, was irresistible. A week later, Colin had heard the voices himself. While walking past the cemetery late at night, he'd stopped in his tracks as an otherworldly melody rose from within the gates. The harmonies were intricate, layered, and painfully beautiful, unlike anything he had ever experienced. He hadn't been able to shake it since. Now, standing at the cemetery, gates under the glow of the full moon, Colin felt the first prick of unease. The iron bars loomed tall against the dark sky, and the cold seemed sharper here, biting at his face and fingers. Still, the memory of that strange, enchanting music propelled him forward. He pushed the gate open, its rusted hinges groaning loudly in protest, and stepped inside. The air inside the cemetery was eerily still, the faint hum of distant traffic muffled as though the space existed in its own dimension. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the clearing where he'd first heard the song. Setting his guitar case down, Colin unpacked his recording equipment. A compact digital recorder, a small microphone, and his notebook. His fingers worked quickly despite the cold, adjusting the recorder to ensure it would pick up even the faintest sound. He aimed the microphone toward the clearing, then sat down against a weathered tombstone to wait. Minutes passed. The wind sighed softly through the trees, but beyond that, there was only silence. The longer he waited, the more doubt crept in. Perhaps the voices had been a fluke, or his imagination had played tricks on him. Colin tapped his fingers impatiently on his guitar case, glancing at the digital recorder's blinking light. Then, as the cold seemed to deepen, he felt the atmosphere shift. The air grew unnaturally still, and the faint hum he remembered from his last visit began to rise. At first it was barely audible, like the distant echo of a choir warming up. But the sound grew steadily, transforming into a melody so intricate and haunting, it made his chest ache. The voices were layered, each one distinct yet perfectly harmonized. A deep baritone blended with a lilting soprano and a mournful alto, their tones weaving a song that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Colin's breath caught in his throat as he adjusted the recorder, ensuring it captured every note. The music seemed alive, its beauty pulling him in, wrapping around him like a cocoon. Though he couldn't understand the words, the melody conveyed an overwhelming sense of longing and sorrow. It felt as though the song was peeling back layers of his soul, exposing thoughts and emotions he hadn't touched in years. For a moment, he was so lost in the music that he didn't notice the subtle change in the air. When the harmony faltered, he blinked, startled by the sudden shift. The voices seemed closer now, their clarity unnerving. His pulse quickened. A chill ran down his spine as the song swelled again, louder this time. It was no longer just music. It was something else. Something sentient. He felt as if the voices were circling him, growing more insistent with every passing second. That's when he heard his name. At first it was soft, almost imperceptible, woven into the fabric of the melody. It could have been his imagination, a trick of the mind born from tension and anticipation. But then it came again, louder and clearer. The unmistakable sound of his own name, carried on the ghostly harmonies. Colin's breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest. The melody twisted, darkening, the once beautiful harmony taking on a sinister edge. He glanced around the clearing, the beam of his flashlight casting frantic, jittery shadows across the graves. The cold deepened, biting through his jacket and into his bones. His flashlight flickered, then went out completely, plunging him into darkness. The voices continued, louder and more urgent, each note resonating in his skull. His name was repeated again and again, no longer a part of the melody but a demand, sharp and commanding. Colin stumbled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The shadows around the graves seemed to move, shifting and coalescing into shapes that weren't entirely human. Panic surged through him as he grabbed his recorder and flashlight, his frozen fingers fumbling with the buttons. The voices rose in a final crescendo, their harmony breaking apart into a chaotic cacophony. Colin's name rang out, clearer than ever, cutting through the noise like a blade. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the frost-slick ground as he bolted for the gate. When he finally burst out of the cemetery, he didn't stop running until he was safe inside his apartment. Slamming the door shut, he pressed his back against it, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. His fingers shook as he played back the recording, half hoping the device had picked up nothing but static. But as the first notes of the ghostly melody played through the speaker, his stomach dropped. The voices were there. Every haunting harmony, every chilling twist of the melody. And beneath it all, woven unmistakably into the song, was his own name. Colin sat at his desk, staring at the digital recorder. The pale glow of his desk lamp illuminated his cramped apartment, casting long shadows that seemed to press in from the corners of the room. He hadn't slept since returning from the cemetery. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it. The harmony of ghostly voices, and the chilling way they had sung his name. The recording hadn't stopped playing in his mind. He had listened to it over and over, trying to make sense of what he had captured. The music was perfect, otherworldly, every note resonating with something deep within him. But the sound of his name, repeated with eerie precision, felt like a warning, or perhaps a summons. By the time the sun rose, Colin knew he couldn't let it go. He needed answers. The next day, he returned to the cafe, hoping Mr. Beckett might know more about the cemetery choir. The old man wasn't hard to find. He was always seated in the same corner, nursing a cup of tea and poring over dusty books about local history. Colin approached him hesitantly, unsure of how to frame his question without sounding insane. Instead of recounting the entire experience, Colin asked Beckett about the choir's origin. The old man leaned back in his chair, his expression turning grave as he explained the story in hushed tones. The cemetery choir, he said, was a legend dating back nearly 2 centuries. According to local lore, the voices belonged to those who had died in despair, their lives cut short by tragedy or unfulfilled ambition. They sang to unburden their souls, hoping their music might be heard by someone who could carry their legacy forward. Beckett added that many who heard the choir were artists, writers, painters, musicians. They were drawn to the cemetery by the beauty of the voices, but those who got too close, who let the music consume them, often vanished without a trace. Colin tried to keep his composure as Beckett spoke, but the old man's words left him shaken. He couldn't help but wonder if the voices had called his name because they had chosen him, or because they wanted something from him. That evening, Colin sat with his guitar, replaying the recording for what felt like the 100th time. He tried to replicate the melody, his fingers strumming tentative chords as he followed the ghostly harmonies. But no matter how hard he tried, the song eluded him. It was as if it resisted being captured, slipping through his grasp like smoke. The frustration grew, gnawing at his already frayed nerves. He scribbled notes in his journal, trying to break down the song into its components, but the structure defied logic. The melody was complex, shifting in ways that seemed almost alive. As the hours passed, a strange compulsion began to take hold of him. The voices weren't just haunting, they were inviting. The song wasn't complete, and it felt as though they were waiting for him to add something to it. By midnight, Colin had made up his mind. He couldn't move on until he understood what the cemetery choir wanted from him. The cemetery was even colder that night, the frost crunching loudly beneath Colin's boots as he retraced his steps to the clearing. This time, he brought more than his recording equipment. His guitar was slung over his shoulder, the strap digging into his collarbone. The moon was obscured by clouds, casting the cemetery in a dim gray light. The rows of tombstones seemed to stretch endlessly, their shapes distorted by the shadows. Colin felt the weight of the place, pressing down on him, heavier than before. As he reached the clearing, the air grew unnaturally still, and the faint hum of the choir began to rise. the voices emerged slowly, like the first tendrils of fog creeping over a lake. The melody was softer this time, almost hesitant, as if the singers were waiting for him to join them. Colin set his guitar case down and took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt foolish, standing there in the cold with his instrument, but the pull of the music was undeniable. He adjusted the guitar strap and let his fingers fall onto the strings. As he strummed the first chord, the voices faltered. The hum wavered, as though the choir was startled by his intrusion. For a moment, Colin hesitated, afraid he had disrupted something sacred. But then the harmony resumed, swelling to meet his tentative notes. He played slowly at first, matching the rhythm of the song as best he could. The voices seemed to respond, adjusting their melody to complement his chords. The air around him thrummed with energy, and for the first time, Colin felt like he was part of something greater than himself. But as the song built in intensity, a strange sensation crept over him. The voices began to shift, growing sharper, more urgent. The harmony twisted, and Colin's name emerged once again, woven into the fabric of the melody. The sound was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. Colin's fingers moved instinctively, the music pouring out of him as if he were a vessel for something far older and more powerful. The world around him seemed to fade, the cemetery dissolving into darkness until there was only the music. And then, without warning, the voices stopped. The abrupt silence was deafening, and Colin's hands froze on the strings. He opened his eyes, realizing for the first time that he had closed them. The clearing was empty, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. But something was different. The shadows around the graves were moving, coalescing into shapes that were more defined, more human. Colin's breath caught as he saw figures emerging from the darkness, translucent, shimmering forms that glided toward him with deliberate grace. The ghosts were singing, but their voices were faint now, like echoes of a fading dream. Colin felt a strange mixture of awe and dread as they surrounded him. Their eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto his. One of the figures stepped closer, its features more distinct than the others. It was a young woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with a sorrow that pierced Colin's heart. She raised a hand, pointing directly at him, and though her lips did not move, he felt her words resonate in his mind. "You must finish the song," she seemed to say. The message as clear as if it had been spoken aloud. Before Colin could respond, the voices rose again, louder this time, their harmonies swelling to an unbearable crescendo. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and the shadows grew darker, closing in around him like a shroud. He stumbled backward, clutching his guitar, as the figures dissolved into the night. The music faded, leaving him alone in the clearing, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. Colin realized two things in that moment. The cemetery choir had chosen him, and their song was far from over. Colin sat in his apartment, staring at the sheet music sprawled across his desk. The pages were chaotic, covered in hastily scribbled notes and half-finished melodies. He had spent the last 3 days locked inside, barely eating or sleeping, consumed by the task of finishing the song. The voices had haunted him since that night in the cemetery, their harmonies echoing in his mind, no matter how hard he tried to shut them out. Every time he picked up his guitar, his fingers seemed to move on their own, weaving fragments of the melody into something new, something wholly unfamiliar, yet undeniably connected to the choir's song. But it wasn't enough. No matter how many times he played it, the music felt incomplete, as if it were missing a crucial piece. And every time he stopped, the silence was worse. He could feel their presence, just at the edges of his perception, watching, waiting. He glanced at the recorder on his desk. It had become both a lifeline and a curse. He had played back the recording dozens of times, trying to decipher the choir's intention. Their voices were clearer now, sharper, and their demand was unmistakable. Finish the song. Colin had no choice. By the fourth night, his exhaustion was palpable, his body running on little more than adrenaline and desperation. The cemetery called to him like a siren, pulling him back despite every instinct that told him to stay away. He packed his guitar and recorder, his hands trembling as he locked the door behind him. The streets were eerily quiet as he made his way to Oakview Cemetery, the chill of the night biting at his exposed skin. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, their iron bars gleaming under the pale light of the crescent moon. Colin hesitated for only a moment before pushing them open and stepping inside. The familiar path to the clearing felt longer this time, the darkness pressing in around him like a living thing. When he reached the clearing, the air was heavy with anticipation. The stillness was oppressive, the silence so complete it seemed to amplify the sound of his own breathing. Colin set his guitar down and stood in the center of the clearing, waiting. The voices began softly, the melody faint and fragile, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Colin knelt, pulling his guitar into his lap, and let his fingers find the strings. The choir's harmony swelled as he joined them, his chords weaving through their song like threads in a tapestry. This time, the music came easier. The missing pieces began to fall into place, the melody building in intensity as Colin surrendered himself to it. His fingers moved with a purpose that felt both his and not his, guided by an unseen force. The choir's voices grew louder, their harmony so perfect it made his chest ache. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, the clearing coming alive with a light that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Shadows moved in the periphery of his vision, but Colin didn't look up. He was close, so close. Then the melody shifted, the harmony twisted, darkening, and Colin felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew colder, and the shadows around him began to take shape. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their translucent forms glowing faintly in the unnatural light. Colin's hands faltered on the strings as the figures closed in. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes dark voids that seemed to pull at his very soul. One of them stepped forward, the young woman he had seen before. Her sorrowful gaze pierced through him as she raised a hand, pointing to his guitar. "You must play," her voice echoed in his mind, the words clear despite her unmoving lips. "Finish it." Colin swallowed hard, his throat dry as he returned his focus to the guitar. The melody surged again, the choir's voices rising to a deafening crescendo. The figures around him grew more distinct, their forms solidifying as the music built toward its climax. As Colin played the final notes, the air around him seemed to shatter. The choir's voices erupted into a thunderous harmony, the force of the sound knocking him backward. He landed hard on the frozen ground, his guitar sliding from his grasp. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the shadows moved. The ghostly figures dissolved, their forms unraveling like smoke. The clearing grew brighter, the oppressive darkness lifting as the choir's song faded into the night. Colin sat up, his chest heaving, as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had finished the song, but the air was still wrong. The stillness wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. As Colin reached for his guitar, a sudden searing pain shot through his chest. He gasped, clutching at his shirt, as the light around him dimmed. The edges of his vision blurred, the world tilting as a cold numbness spread through his body. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the young woman's face, her expression filled with something that looked like regret. When Colin opened his eyes, he was standing in the clearing. The air was still, the night quiet. He looked down at himself, confused to find his guitar lying on the ground, untouched. His hands were trembling, but when he reached for the instrument, his fingers passed through it like smoke. Panic surged as he looked around, his gaze falling on a familiar figure slumped against a tombstone. Himself. The realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't standing. He was floating. He wasn't alive. The choir's voices rose again, soft and mournful, as the ghostly figures emerged from the shadows once more. This time, Colin was among them. The young woman stepped forward, her sorrowful gaze meeting his. Now you understand, her voice echoed in his mind. The song was never for you. It was for us. As the choir began to sing, Colin's voice joined theirs, weaving seamlessly into the harmony. The melody was perfect now, complete in a way that felt both devastating and beautiful. In the distance, the first faint rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale light over the cemetery. But the choir's song continued, undisturbed, as if the world beyond the graves no longer mattered. Colin sang, his voice rising with the others as he faded into the shadows. And so, dear listeners, the mournful song of the cemetery choir comes to an end, its final notes fading into the chill of the night. Colin's tale reminds us that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some voices are meant to echo forever in the shadows. But don't stray too far, because the darkness still holds many more secrets to unveil. Next time, we invite you to step into the room without a door. Picture this: a newlywed couple brimming with hope moves into a quaint old house, eager to begin their new life together. But in the basement, they discover something impossible, a room that can only be entered, never exited. What horrors lie within its walls? And once they step inside, will they ever escape? The answer awaits in our next Sinister tale, The Room Without a Door. Until then, lock your doors, dim your lights, and remember, curiosity may lead you to the truth, but it may also lead you to something far more terrifying. Don't miss it. Join us next time, if you dare.